In this talk, we will take a look at the preview of how migrations work in Entity Framework 7, more specifically in ASP.NET vNext, otherwise known as ASP.NET MVC 6, and using core CLR. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start by creating a new project, and we're going to call it Web Application Demo. Go ahead and click OK. On the next prompt, we're going to select what type of web application we're going to write, and we're going to use ASP.NET 5, and we're going to use Web API primarily because we want to take a look at Entity Framework and its migrations API, not the entire functionality of MVC 6. Let's go ahead and click OK. This will take a second to create a project. In the meantime, I'm going to say that Beta 5 was published earlier in a week, last week, technically speaking. As a result, because templates have not been updated yet, they use Beta 4 references. And in this case, we got errors for a second, but then the NuGet packages got restored. If we take a look at project.json, we will see that it's still using Beta 4. So this time, unlike last time, I wanted to show you guys how to use new managed NuGet Package Manager Visual Studio 2015. And in this case, to get to this UI, you just right-click and say Manage NuGet Packages. First thing I want to do is update the installed packages. And as you can see, a little blue arrow indicates that update is available. By default, it doesn't pick beta, it picks less stable version. So I'll go ahead and select this version. There is no upgrade all that I could find, so we're going to upgrade one at a time. Essentially, it's the same thing as editing project.json, but let's learn other ways we can manage NuGet packages. Got one more to update. Actually, I didn't double check. Yeah, it's Beta 5. That's the newest release available. I want to make sure I use Beta 5 for all of these. Let's go ahead and click Upgrade. After we get done with that, we need to install Entity Framework. So I'm going to switch to All, and then type Entity Framework in here. And we should get Entity Framework. In this case, Entity Framework is not on Beta 5, it's on Beta 4. And we'll go ahead and install that version. After this is done, we're going to find other packages we need to make Entity Framework work. It's a little bit of a pain to find, so instead of scrolling through a billion packages, since I'm going to use SQL Server, I'm going to pick SQL Server, and this one is on Beta 5. And we're going to install that. Because we're going to use migrations against SQL Server, I'm going to also install SQL Server.design, Entity Framework.SQL Server.design. And finally, I want to install commands, which is something that I need to use for migrations. And that package is called Entity Framework.commands. This one is on Beta 5. Let's go ahead and click OK. And then hopefully we'll be ready to build. And we'll go ahead and give it a try. Go ahead and build solution. If we had any errors, then we will get them. So far so good. Take a look at project.json. It's the exact same thing I did in the first walkthrough, except the new versions are everywhere set as Beta 5, except the core Entity Framework package, which is still on Beta 4. To verify that everything works, we can simply use the default controller. And if we go to API/values, we should see something. That will simply verify that all the NuGet packages got properly restored and there is nothing else we need to do in order to get this project up and going. Let's see how a browser comes in, API/values. That's the correct URL. We need to give it a second for the first compile. And hopefully our page will come in. What we're going to do after that is actually create entity framework context with just a single table, and we're going to alter it and add some columns to it and just kind of see how migrations work in production as well as in development time. So this came through. It says value 1, value 2, and if we take a look to see what controller did, that all looks good. So we're gonna go ahead and delete all this, keeping it clean, and then we're gonna rename values controller to person controller. And rename the class as well. So we'll come back to filling in the details. Let's start working on our context and our class. So we'll go ahead and put them into their own folder. Keeping things clean, we're going to call it models. And we're going to create another model. Similarly to what we did last time, it's going to be simply a class. And we're going to call it person. And oops, mistyped that. Let's rename it to a person, not persons, keeping naming conventions clean. And what we're gonna do now is add some properties to it. So this is gonna be our primary key property, and we're gonna give it a couple more. We're going to say first name, and let's add one more, and this one is going to be last name. Kind of ready to go here, so let's remove unneeded users. We're going to need system in a few minutes, and now we're going to add one more class. Again, it's going to be simple class. We're going to call it person context, and this specific class is going to inherit from DB context, which, if you remember, is the core part of entity framework. We're going to hit control period to get some suggestions, and we're going to add using Microsoft.data.entities. Let's make sure we can build. Still good. Now we're going to add property here. This is going to be of type of DB set of person, and we're going to just call it people. So this is our table abstraction inside DB context, which is our database abstraction. Now we need to do some configuration. And if we type override, we're going to get on model creating method. We're going to override it, and first of all we're going to create table configuration for our person table, which is going to go for the model builder entity of type person, and then one of the parameters is the table builder. If we scroll down, we're going to see if it's entity type builder of action, and we're going to just call it P is our variable, and we're going to say P to table, and the name we're going to give it is just people. Actually, let's change the name to person. So if we look at the type that got returned here, this is the model builder type. Now if we type table, and so made a little mistake. This is the generic way to define table builder, but in our case, we need to specify it for relational database, for SQL Server in our case. So now our type should be entity type builder, which is similar in Entity Framework 6. It used to be type called entity type configuration of T. Now it's entity type builder of T. And now we can define some properties in here. And again, so it's going to be strongly typed. So I should be able to type this and see first name. And we're going to call it, we're going to add required method to it, as well as maximum length of, say, 30. One thing to notice is in the Entity Framework 6, you could write a class per entity and sort of add them to configuration collection. That API does not exist anymore. So if you imagine if you have a whole bunch of tables in here, this whole model creating would be quite large. But you can easily figure out how to change that. So let's create another class as a demo, public class person config. And this is going to be just a plain vanilla class. And on top of that, we're just going to make it static. So just one less thing to worry about. And we're going to create a single static method in it. Public static void configure person, and it's going to take model builder as a single parameter. And now I can simply cut this code out, put in my static class, and then say person configure person, and pass in a model builder. So you could sort of play some games and make this code a little bit more pulpable and maintainable by separating classes per table. But so far, we're not going to spend too much time on that. We make sure we can build. And now we should be able to use this context inside of our controller. However, before we do that, we're going to go through the same steps we did before and add entity framework to the list of services available in our application. We're going to type services inside of our startup configure services method, add entity framework. Now we're going to run against SQL Server. So we're going to add SQL Server to it. Then we're going to add a specific DB context to a list of injectables. And that's the important thing to remember, is that we are providing all the services that are injected into our application by adding them to a service collection. Finally, we need to specify where this connection string comes from. Just like in the previous demo, we need to supply a configuration method. I don't believe I imported those references. So let's go to Microsoft.framework.configuration model, and we're going to import this one is still in beta 4 apparently. What I did find that this version of configuration model.json, for whatever reason, does not properly work with beta 5, throwing an exception. So we're going to kind of walk through the steps, but at the end, we're going to hard code the connection string. So let's add a configuration property, configuration. See if we can get the import. We're going to call it configuration. Configuration. Config. And it's going to be get and private set. Now in a startup, we can set it. So we can say var config equal new configuration. And then we can assign our property here, config equal config. And let's see if we can import the appropriate namespace and fix the spelling here. Let's fix the references. So this is the appropriate one we use. I think this is kind of a downside of beta 4 on one version and beta 5 in another version. But this should work. And ordinarily we would write config.add.json file and config.json. And then we would add config.json to the list of files, which we can do by selecting add new item, searching for config, and I like changing the name to small c. And now we can pretend that all this works. So this is going to be server is going to be local server, and database we're going to call web application demo. Web app demo. And this would work. However, when we run it, we're going to get an exception here. And ordinarily the code what we would write, we would say config dot options, and then dot, try typing it again, dot use SQL server. Our IntelliSense is not quite working because we're probably missing a using statement here. Using Microsoft dot data dot entity. I think that's where this method is located. And here we're just going to say config and provide a connection string, which is going to be coming from our config.json. So it would be data colon default connection colon connection string. Here we go. I made a typo here. This config is already options, so I'm just gonna call it like so. So this would have almost worked, except as I mentioned in beta 5 this throws an error. So instead we're gonna hack it and simply put this connection string as a key and set its value with what's coming in JSON file, which is this string right here. Now we got that in. Okay, so configuration now works. Now we should be able to run it, except now we need to start working with migrations. So just like in NT Framework 6, you can work with migrations at design time, at runtime as well. So first of all, let's try to create a migration. So we need to create an initial migration before we go much further. To do that, we got to drop down to command prompt. So I already created a shortcut to developer command prompt for Visual Studio. I'll go ahead and run that. Then I need to switch to appropriate location. So I'm going to open this folder in Windows Explorer, switch to prompt, switch to this folder, to source, and then project. Now it should be in the right location. As you can see, I see my project.json and my startup.cs. I'm in the right location. Now I need to run a command. So if I type dnx, which is .NET executable runtime, you can see that it's available. One thing I did not do, however, is to initialize my command, or more specifically, add this command to a list of commands in project.json. And this seems to be that the standard is to call this command ef. And I'll just go ahead and copy instead of making typos. And the specific commands are included inside this entity framework.commands assembly. Let me build it one more time. Seems good. Now I can invoke it by using dnx, then space, then period, then space, and then ef. I'm just going to run it to look at the help page for entity framework commands. It'll take a second to come up. You can see cute little unicorn. I'm sure some of you guys heard Scott Hanselman referring to Entity Framework as the Unicorn Edition. So there's a little cute unicorn ASCII art, and it's running beta 5, which is the one we just installed. And now we're gonna use migrations. If we want to look at the help page for migration, we type dnx.ef migration, and we should get a specific help page instead of generic help page for all commands, specific help page for migrations command. And as you can see, we can add, apply, list, script, and remove. Let's walk through what this means. Add simply adds a new migration. It's equivalent to Entity Framework 6 PowerShell command add-migration. Apply is equivalent to update-database. List, I don't believe there was an equivalent to list all the migrations. Script will generate a script that you can hand over to your DBA to apply migrations manually by running a SQL script. Finally, remove is removing a migration. In my case, I want to add a migration, and I'm going to call it initial. Because project file is just essentially is a location. It doesn't list all the files. You see that that hit an error. Let's take a look to see what the error was. Okay, so we missed a configuration. Let's take a look how we can fix it. And the error is that I didn't quite configure things right, because we didn't add the JSON file. So instead, what I want to do, even though I used the dictionary method, but what instead I wanted to do is to set a value inside the dictionary, inside of iConfiguration options, to using a set method. Let's build that. And let's give it one more try. Clear the window, and let's try it one more time. Let's see if we're gonna have more success this time around. And we did not. Let's see what the error is. No data stores are configured. Same error. So digging a little bit deeper, what I'm dealing with is the effects of learning the new environment. So what I did not do, I did not use some .NET version manager to point to a specific runtime. So I should have done that first time I opened Visual Studio Development command prompt. Now let's add the migration. Same command, dnx.ef migration add initial. Now that we picked the actual runtime for the system to use, it behaves much better. And as you noticed, migration folder immediately popped up because it's not included like it was in CS_proj file. If you take a look at what's included here, you notice that my configurations got completely ignored. So if I take a look at person context and look at this class, you can see that I made maximum length 30. However, that code got promptly ignored, and the data was generated using varchar max. So That's the side effect of Entity Framework being in beta and migrations are not fully implemented. However, the way you deal with migrations seem to be pretty solid according to all the blog posts. So now we're ready to apply migrations. To do that, we flip to our list of databases. The one that I call Web Application Demo does not exist. So I should be able to apply them. And so this is essentially a development environment. So I am a developer. I got the latest of the project. Now I'm gonna apply to bring my local database up to date. And we're gonna call migrations apply command. So list of commands is EF, migration is the subcommand, and apply is the parameter to that command. And if I flip to my SQL server, now you see that web app demo database got promptly created. Now what do we do when we run an application? So I'm going to delete it for a minute and write some code inside the startup to apply migrations programmatically. In this case, we're going to create a new instance of our context, and we're going to use using statement so we can properly dispose of it. And we're going to use app.application services.get service, and the type of the service is going to be type of not DB context but person context. And I'm just going to cast the result of that to person context. You could easily write an extension method that would do safe casting, but now I can get to my database object and I can call as SQL server dot apply migrations. So here's how we would programmatically apply migrations at application startup. Whether you want to do that or not, that's a secondary question. You can always generate a script, but this is another way to do it, and some people used to do it in Entity Framework 6, and this code is essentially a replacement to a database initializer called migrate to latest version initializer. Now we're ready to write some code into our controller, run it, and see if our database gets created. Switch to controller. It's a person controller, and we're not going to make it asynchronous quite yet. We're simply gonna keep it synchronous. So it's gonna return enumerable of a person, and we just need to add a using statement here. Now, how do we deal with our context? Context is just another injectable now, and this allows us to delegate the creation and disposal of all these services to the runtime, to MVC runtime, instead of remembering to do it all ourselves. Now we're gonna just simply save the context injectable into our variable, and now we can use it here. So we could say underscore ctx people dot order by, and we're gonna order by, I don't know, just do last name, and that's it. Now we're ready to run it. So if we navigate to API/persons, we should be able to see the database created. If you remember, I dropped the database. Now let's see if we can create it. I'll run that. Instead of API values, this should be API persons. I think that's proper typing. Let's see if we can get an empty array, which should be the result of our application if everything worked properly. Let's give it a try. Let's give it a second to run through. And if there are any errors, we'll figure out what's wrong with them. And still running, and we got an exception here. And for some reason the injection point did not quite work. Let's double check. Well, our connection string was actually correct because we were able to script the migrations. However, in this case we got an error. So let's figure out what's wrong. So what I did, I specify using SQL Server, whereas the proper way of doing it would have been to specify as relational. So I'm using context, database as relational, apply migrations. Let's run it one more time. Hopefully our database is going to be created, so let's refresh this. Database not there yet. One thing I did not do is switch this to say persons. Let's see if our database is gonna get properly created this time. I believe, okay, so it got created. Let's take a look, see if our database is there. Yes, it is. Gonna navigate to a table, gonna edit some rows, and we're gonna just add something to verify that everything is working as expected and we're not chasing ghosts. So let's refresh that. All right, so we got the data. Now the next step, what we want to do is create a migration pretending that our database is evolving. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna go to person and we're going to add another property to it, and this time let's use date time, and we're gonna call it date added. Doesn't really matter what it is. Actually, I'm going to make it nullable. So far so good. Now we're gonna add a migration. If you remember, what we had to do is add migration, and we're gonna call it person date edit, and the migrations API is going to scaffold our database based on the connection string and add another migration that adds a new column. As we can see, date edit is the column that was added, and it is nullable, and type is actually datetime2, not date. So eventually we can, once the scaffolding is working properly, we'll be able to deal with the improper generation by using either our own custom conventions or just simply changing the generated code to match what we're trying to do. In the meantime, let's do this. Let's simply run the app. Go to persons. Migrations, if you remember, the apply migrations code is still in the startup. So what we should see is the column being added, and our result should have the same one person where date added should be null. But we should still be able to see it. Let's see if we're successful in this test. Yeah, because you can see date added is null. If we want to verify that all that is working properly, we're gonna edit some rows, and we're just gonna punch in a date. 1/1/2000 is a valid date, and if we refresh it, there's our date coming in. Alright, so in this quick demo, we worked out creation of a DB context for Web API with a single table, persons. We applied migrations two ways. First of all, we used the development API using the development command prompt NEF. Remember, like I forgot, that you need to set the version you want to use. If we wanted to see what versions we have, we can type dnvm list, and you can see that are all the versions that we have. I still have beta 4, but here's my beta 5, and the default is CLR for x64, which is what my machine is. That's the API that I used. And then in addition to running EF command using dnx executable, then .ef and etc. You remember all the commands that we did. We applied migration that way, creating a database. Then we put code into our application itself to create the database and or update database programmatically during the startup, adding code to configure services method, not configure services, but post injectable, where our DB context has been configured already as an injectable. I'm just getting an instance of it using dependency injection API, specifically get service. All right, I think that's all I wanted to cover in this session. We'll see what we want to do next session about. Thank you. Bye.